In order for the URL /restaurant/detail/19 to work, I need to change the detail page so it can respond to this path, because the 19, the restaurant ID, it's now in the URL path instead of being in the query string. And that is something I can do with the @page directive that is at the top of the Razor page. What I can do here is define a string parameter that describes to ASP.NET Core what the route or what the path should look like to reach this page. Now the path is always going to start with /restaurants/detail unless I configure ASP.NET Core differently, or unless I start a path with a slash here and say, no, actually the way you're going to reach this page is to go to /food/place, but that's not what we want to do. What we want to do is introduce an additional segment for the URL path that's going to contain a parameter, which is the restaurant ID. And for that, what I do is I specify the name of something inside of curly braces. So if I specify ID, what I'm saying is that in order to reach this page, this detail page, you have to use /restaurants/detail/ some identifier. That might be the number 12, or it could be a string like XYZ126. There's actually constraints that I can put on these parameters, like the int constraint that says this should be parsable into an integer. I can also make this parameter optional, so I could say with a question mark that you can reach this page by going to /restaurants/detail without passing an ID, and you can also go to /restaurants/detail/3. But the important part to remember is that now the third segment of the URL, so whatever comes after /restaurants/detail, that third segment is what ASP.NET will consider to be a parameter named ID. Now, if I were to leave this parameter name as just ID, then what my tag helpers over here would do is still put restaurant ID into the query string, because these tag helpers are smart enough to look at the page and say, what parameters do you take in the route? Not the query string, not posted form values, not a header. This is something that has to go into the route or the path of the URL. And so what I want is actually restaurant ID, and this is not an optional parameter. I have to have this restaurant ID to do my job, and yes, it does have to be an integer. So with that change in place, and this is the only change we've made to introduce this parameter restaurant ID, let's come back to the browser and do a refresh on /restaurants/detail/19, where we used to get a 404 result. But now, because ASP.NET Core understands to pass this value, parse it out of the URL, and pass it to my page as a restaurant ID, we're now looking at the details for a restaurant with an ID of 19. And if I go back to the list of all restaurants, I should now be able to go to Scott's Pizza by going to /restaurant/detail/1. Now, you must realize I didn't have to change anything in the list page to generate this new URL format. That's because the tag helpers, ASP-page and ASP-route, they generated this link with a restaurant ID in the path instead of the query string, because those tag helpers, they know my pages and they understand their parameters. And again, because this parameter is required, I cannot reach the detail page without having some identifier in this place. And that identifier has to be a number, an integer. So we now have all the pieces in place where we can actually retrieve a restaurant from the data source and display it. Let's work on that next.